He caught the discreet glow of recording screens. Strangers were documenting every second, and the pressure built. The attendant's smile faltered. She looked from Devon to the woman, caught between fairness and convenience, and then the word slipped out. The one phrase that turned unease into outrage. "You people." The woman said it casually, but it struck the cabin like thunder. Gasps followed. Eyes widened. Devon felt something shift inside him. Not rage, but a cold, sharpened clarity. The mask of civility had fallen away. The prejudice, once wrapped in politeness, now lay bare for everyone to see. A journalist sitting a few rows back stood and spoke, identifying herself, her press badge glinting. She called out the injustice openly, her words carrying across the cabin. Another passenger, a young woman, revealed she had been live streaming the entire encounter. Already, hundreds, soon thousands, were watching. The woman's face flushed. She tried to backpedal, insisting she wasn't racist, that she donated to charity, that she had black friends. But the damage was done. The captain arrived next. An authority figure. Surely now fairness would prevail. Devon handed over his pass once more, confident the truth was undeniable. But even here, bias crept in. The captain hesitated. He, too, suggested compromise. Maybe Devon could move to another seat. Maybe everyone could just be flexible. Devon stared at him, disbelief rising like bile. Even now, with proof in his hand, he was the one asked to bend. Even now, the weight of keeping the peace was placed squarely on his shoulders. The cabin was silent, every passenger holding their breath, waiting for the breaking point. Devon's phone buzzed in his pocket. Urgent messages, meetings, the outside world demanding his attention. But none of it mattered. Not now. Not when his dignity was on trial at 30,000 feet. And then he said it. His voice calm, but cold. "You have no idea what you've just started." The air shifted. Passengers leaned forward. The woman blinked. Momentarily unsettled, even the captain faltered. For the first time, the balance of power felt unstable. What no one in that cabin yet realized was that Devon held a secret far greater than any of them could imagine. A truth that would not only silence the arrogance in front of him, but expose an entire system built on quiet prejudice. The question wasn't whether he belonged in that seat. The real question was, what would happen when the truth came crashing down? The cabin had become a stage, every eye fixed on the confrontation. Devon stood there with his boarding pass in hand, the captain's authority pressing against him. The flight attendant hovering nervously, and Victoria Hartwell, the woman in his seat, wearing a smug smile that said she had already won. And why wouldn't she believe that? The airline seemed ready to bend for her. The crew echoed her entitlement. The passengers, though unsettled, mostly stayed silent. Devon, despite all his proof, was still being asked to surrender. The injustice was so sharp, it burned. The woman leaned forward, her voice rising, her words meant to cut. She accused him of scheming, of creating a scene to grab attention or score compensation. Then she delivered the fatal insult. With venom disguised as reason, she said real first-class passengers did not look like him. Real first-class passengers dressed differently, acted differently, belonged. It was humiliation sharpened to a knife's edge. A lifetime of quiet biases now spoken aloud in front of dozens of witnesses. The crowd gasped. Some looked away in shame, others in horror. Devon felt the weight of it pressing down on him, threatening to smother his composure. For a brief moment, the helplessness returned, the familiar trap of being told to swallow disrespect for the sake of peace. But not this time. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket. The cabin went still. Passengers craned their necks, phones tilted, recording every motion. Devon unlocked his screen and tapped an icon, revealing an app most people had never seen before. Sleek, simple, marked with a corporate logo that few recognized at first glance. The flight attendant frowned. "What is that?" she whispered. Devon's voice cut through the air, steady and unshakable. "This," he said, "is the executive control panel of Pinnacle Airways, and this," his finger hovered over a glowing command, "is what happens when someone pushes a CEO too far." The words hung like thunder before the strike. "Passengers," gasped, uncertain if this was bluff or reality. The woman's smirk faltered, confusion flashing across her face. The captain stiffened, his authority suddenly feeling fragile. And then Devon pressed the button. She thought it was just another ordinary flight. A wealthy woman sliding into her first-class seat, placing her designer bag beside her, and settling in as if the world belonged to her. But then a man walked down the aisle, ticket in hand, and stopped at her row. His seat was the very one she refused to leave. What began as a simple misunderstanding quickly twisted into something darker, an unspoken judgment about who belongs and who does not. Eyes turned, whispers spread, and the quiet tension of racism filled the cabin like heavy air. He was calm, polite, even patient. But with every passing second, the humiliation grew, and the crowd waited to see if he would break. What the woman did not know, and what no one in that cabin expected, was that this man carried a secret powerful enough to change everything. So the question is, what happens when prejudice collides with truth at 30,000 feet? Devon Mitchell had lived his entire life proving himself. From the classrooms of Harvard Business School to the high-stakes boardrooms of New York, he carried the weight of being the only black man in spaces where power was reserved for others. His success was undeniable. He had built a technology company from the ground up, turning it into a force that reshaped entire industries. But even with titles, wealth, and recognition, one truth never left him. People still judged him first, by the color of his skin and only later by the content of his achievements. On this day, Devon was exhausted. 3 days of back-to-back investor meetings had left him drained, his mind running on little more than determination and coffee. All he wanted was to board his flight, sink into his seat, and escape into silence. He had chosen comfort over presentation, dark jeans, a hoodie, and sneakers that only someone who knew their worth would recognize. It was a small rebellion against a world that demanded he always look like he was ready to justify his place. The airport around him buzzed with its usual chaos, boarding calls echoing, travelers rushing, and tired employees moving with robotic precision. For Devon, this was routine. He had flown countless times, often first class, not as a luxury but as a necessity. His time was valuable and every hour mattered. Yet every trip carried the same unspoken test. Would people see him as he was, or would they see a stereotype before they ever saw a man? As he approached the gate, his boarding pass in hand, a familiar tension stirred inside him. He had felt it in lobbies, restaurants, and corporate meetings. The invisible line between belonging and intrusion. He brushed it off with the calm of someone used to enduring it, but deep down he knew that moments like these could change in an instant. For Devon, the seat he was about to take was more than just a place to rest. It was a reminder that he had earned his position, his right to be here, through endless struggle and sacrifice. What he did not know was that this simple flight would become the stage for a public confrontation that revealed more than prejudice. It would expose the quiet, cruelty of entitlement, the weight of systemic racism, and the hidden power he carried within him. The plane was ready, passengers lined up, and as Devon prepared to step forward into first class, he had no idea that this short journey would turn into a moment the entire world would soon be talking about. Devon stepped onto the jet bridge with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before. His boarding pass read Seat 2A, first class, window, a small slice of comfort after 3 punishing days. But as he entered the cabin, his eyes landed on something that made his heart sink. There in his seat sat a blonde woman dressed in luxury from head to toe. Her designer bag occupied the space beside her, as though it had every right to claim territory. She scrolled casually through her phone, not even glancing up as Devon paused in the aisle. For a moment he thought maybe she had made an honest mistake. Seat mix-ups happened. But when he spoke, the tone of her response cut deeper than any accident ever could. Without looking at his boarding pass, without even truly looking at him, she dismissed his claim. She had settled in. She was comfortable. Surely he could find another seat. The words weren't just careless, they carried weight. They suggested that his presence here was negotiable, conditional, even questionable. And in that instant, the familiar feeling returned. That invisible wall, that unspoken judgment. You don't belong here. He tried again, calm but firm, pointing to his pass. The seat was his, assigned, clear. But her eyes, now lifted, said more than her words ever could. They scanned his hoodie, his jeans, his sneakers, and landed on him with the kind of cold certainty that had followed him his whole life. Her voice dripped with polite venom. Mistakes happen. People like him should understand. She was a loyal customer, she reminded him, a platinum member. Surely the crew could find him something more appropriate. That word, appropriate, hit like a slap. Behind Devon, passengers began to notice. Some turned their heads, others looked away, pretending not to see. The silence of strangers weighed heavier than open insults. He glanced at his watch, more to ground himself than to check the time. He had meetings, emails, responsibilities that shaped entire industries. Yet here he was, reduced again to defending his right to sit in a chair he had already paid for. But still he stayed calm. He asked her once more, his voice measured, to check her boarding pass. And that's when her mask slipped further. She laughed. A short, sharp sound meant to humiliate. "This is first class," she said, her gaze sweeping over him like he was a child trying to sneak into an exclusive club. The message was unmistakable. You do not belong. The tension thickened. Other passengers watched now like silent jurors. Some wore pity, others curiosity, a few open discomfort. And then came the flight attendant, polished smile, professional tone. She listened to the woman's version first, nodding along. When she turned to Devon, her cheer dimmed, her words laced with subtle doubt. Yes, his boarding pass confirmed it. Yes, the seat was his. But Mrs. Hartwell, the woman in his seat, was a valued customer. Perhaps, the attendant suggested, Devon might be willing to move to another seat, maybe even with priority service as compensation. It was happening again. The quiet expectation that he should bend, that his rights should shrink in the name of keeping the peace. That harmony mattered more than justice. Devon's voice stayed steady, but his chest burned. He repeated, this was his seat, and he wasn't moving. The woman smirked, sensing she still held the advantage. She leaned back, speaking louder now, as if to rally the cabin to her side. She hinted that he was making a scene for attention, that maybe he wanted an upgrade or compensation. The old, toxic narrative that a black man in spaces of privilege must be running some sort of game spilled out of her with ease. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Phones appeared. The cabin filled with a single, chilling confirmation. Flight 1847, grounded by CEO override. Return to gate immediately. Seconds later, the captain's radio crackled. Flight 1847, this is Tower Control. We've received a CEO directive to return to gate. Confirm status. The captain froze, eyes darting from Devon to the passengers. The truth was undeniable now. Devon wasn't just another traveler. He wasn't a man begging for respect. He was the owner of the very airline they were sitting in. The cabin erupted. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, live streams exploded with comments. The story had escaped the walls of the aircraft, spilling into the world in real time. Victoria's face drained of color. Her confidence cracked, collapsing into stammering disbelief. She whispered, that's not possible. You can't. But the truth towered over her excuses. Devon turned to her, his voice no longer just calm. It was commanding, almost merciless. Mrs. Hartwell, you questioned my place here. You dismissed my proof. You called me a fraud, a manipulator, a man who didn't belong. And yet this seat, this aircraft, this airline, belongs to me. The silence that followed was absolute. Passengers stared in awe, the weight of the reversal sinking in. Everything had shifted. The oppressed was no longer powerless. The aggressor was exposed, stripped of her shield of privilege. For Devon, the moment wasn't just about victory. It was about showing every silent witness what systemic racism looked like when dragged into the light. It was about proving that no wealth, no entitlement, no arrogant dismissal could erase truth. And, as the plane turned back toward the gate, Devon's words echoed in every corner of the cabin. This isn't just about me. This is about what happens every day to people who look like me, and today it ends here. The passengers held their breath, bracing for what would come next, because the fight was no longer just about a seat. It was about justice. And justice had just taken control of the plane. The aircraft rolled back toward the gate, but the silence inside was louder than any engine roar. Devon remained standing, his presence no longer questioned, his authority undeniable. For passengers who had doubted, for crew who had wavered, for the woman who had mocked him, every assumption now lay shattered. When the plane stopped and the jet bridge connected, airport officials and executives were already waiting. The cabin buzzed with whispered disbelief, phones vibrating with live updates, social media feeds exploding with hashtags and viral clips. What had begun as a private humiliation was now a national spectacle. Victoria Hartwell sat frozen, her perfect image in ruins. She had not just picked the wrong seat. She had revealed to the world how entitlement, arrogance, and casual racism play out when no one expects consequences. Tears streaked her face, but they carried no weight compared to the scars her words had left behind. She apologized in a trembling voice, but Devon did not flinch. He knew the truth. Her remorse came not from recognizing his humanity, but from realizing his power. And yet, Devon's response was not fueled by vengeance. As he stepped off the plane, facing a crowd of reporters and flashing cameras, he carried something heavier than anger: responsibility. Because what had happened to him was not unique. His wealth, his title, his ownership of the airline had protected him from being erased, but millions of others had no such shield. For them, humiliation stayed hidden, written off as misunderstanding, buried in complaint files that never saw daylight. That thought burned deeper than any insult. He understood that if a man with everything could still be treated as if he had nothing, then the system itself was broken. And if he had the power to expose it, he had the duty to change it. The story spread across the world within hours. Headlines declared how a black CEO grounded his own flight after being told he did not belong. Hashtags trended. Civil rights. Leaders weighed in. Thousands shared their own stories. Quiet humiliations in airports, restaurants, workplaces. Moments where their dignity had been tested by the same invisible wall of prejudice. Devon's stand had become more than a headline. It was a mirror held up to a society that still asked people of color to shrink themselves for the comfort of others. For Devon, the impact was not measured in stock prices or news cycles. It was measured in voices. The older couple on the plane who nodded with recognition because they had lived the same injustice their entire lives. The student who streamed the event, showing her generation that silence was no longer an option. The journalist who called it out in real time, proving that bearing witness can be an act of courage. As he addressed the cameras, Devon spoke not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told, in words or in silence, "You don't belong here." His voice was calm, but every sentence carried weight. This was not a customer service issue, he said. This was not about one rude passenger. This was about systemic racism, about an industry and a society that needed to change. And then he left them with a truth that lingered long after the microphones were lowered. What happened on that plane, he said, was not about who I am. It was about what I look like. That is the reality people like me face every day. But today I chose not to move. And because I didn't, the world had to watch. The image of him walking away, steady, composed, unapologetic, was replayed again and again. For some, it was vindication. For others, it was a wake-up call. But for everyone, it was unforgettable. And so the question is left with us. How many more times must people prove their humanity before we finally decide that dignity is not optional?